Well, hi there, guys. So today I'm going to try to answer the question, how far right has the Overton window in this country shifted? So if you log on to X, for example, it is just an absolute hate fest now, isn't it? Full of just right-wing ghouls, targeting any minority that you'd care to name. But I'm going to start this video with sort of a simple premise, really, which is that right-wing economics, so Thatcherism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, died in 2008. So if that's the case, and if the right were not able to make a sort of meaningful political case on the economy, and they were no longer able to make the case that the economy could improve people's lives, then we were always going to be looking towards culture as the way in which the right would reinvent itself or keep itself relevant in the modern times. So with that in mind, I want to think back a little bit to that coalition government of 2010 to 2015 and remember how David Cameron and his cabinet were approaching issues of culture. And it's quite interesting, really, because it's a little bit ambiguous when you look at it in totality. So in that coalition government, we had Theresa May obviously implementing the hostile environment. We had Cameron, talking about bringing immigration down to the tens of thousands. And we also had, endless scaremongering about scroungers on benefits, single mums, and that was as cover for the government's austerity agenda. But interestingly, in 2013, we also had that government legalising gay marriage. They also introduced other sort of liberal social policies such as shared parental leave and the Turing law, which sought to pardon men convicted of historical homosexual acts. So we can argue about whether the Lib Dems led on those policies, but they wouldn't have been pushed through without endorsement or support from the Tories. Now, of course, at that time, outside of government, we also had UKIP catering to what David Cameron called the fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists. And inside government, we had, a sort of hardline rump of right-wing MPs. And both of those groups were obsessed at that time with Europe. And there was a sort of steady drumbeat of noise from the media as well, seeking to blame the EU for all of our problems. But I think for the most part, looking back on it now, despite it being one of the most right-wing governments in history due to their austerity policies, in terms of sort of parliamentary governance and in terms of culture, it was not actually that much different to anything that we hadn't seen under Thatcher, for example. The bogeymen changed, but the overall tone was sort of familiar. And, even as late as 2018, there was some sort of structure to the way that politics was being done. So if you remember at that time, there was that scandal about the Windrush generation. And Amber Rudd, she actually resigned as a result of that issue, which is just unthinkable these days. So that then brings us to Boris Johnson. And I think that is a sort of inflection point for this country, really. So because Boris needed every MP to back his Brexit bill unquestioningly, he got rid of most of what we would call the moderates within the Tory parties. Think of people like David Gauke, Rory Stewart, people like that. And so he emboldened those nutjob MPs like, Mark Francois or Steve Baker. The media also seemed to be sort of increasingly radicalised at that time as well. Their reporting around Brexit was just frenzied, and there were daily attacks on sort of large sections of the population. So there was a definite shift at that time in, how people were interacting and how people received information on social media. And because Brexit became a sort of zero-sum game where Remainers had to be crushed at all costs, and where compromise was sort of seen as a dirty word, the idea that people might need to work together across ideological divides, or the notion that we might have disagreements, but eventually we could come to some sort of agreed position, was just torched. And that then brings us to politics in the current day. At every step since 2010, the right in this country have been encouraged and or appeased, coupled with the phenomenon that I've just mentioned, in terms of politics, the media and social media, has meant that we now have a wildly reactionary rump of the population and also people within Parliament, which only knows how to destroy and divide. And because anyone seen as moderate was cast into the wilderness a long time ago, there are no mitigating influences on these people and these forces now. So whereas with the coalition government, we had the Tory wets, we had the Lib Dems, as a check on these crazed voices and people, they're now long gone. And if you remember, back then we had UKIP influencing politics from the right, but they were essentially a single issue party. So, okay, maybe two issues, with the EU being a proxy for immigration. But what do we have now? We've got the two main parties on the right fighting it out to see who can be the most reactionary and the most hateful. Whereas back then UKIP on its own occupied that space. So now we also have the media and powerful voices on social media amplifying that sort of hateful rhetoric. and we have absolutely no meaningful opposition within the power structure on the right. And then finally, we also have the Labour Party and the current government sort of dancing to their tune on immigration. So in answer to my own question, I think the Overton window has shifted significantly to the right over the last 15 years or so. Forces in this country have been unleashed which are very hard to now put back in their box. I mean, if we had a more measured media environment, or if, social media was more regulated, there might be some slight checks on that rightward arc, but really that's just tinkering around the edges. No, the real issue is that when you appease the right, and when you let them make the political weather, they will always demand that you go further and further right. There's nothing that you can do that will satisfy them. So then the next question then is, so where do we go from here? And for me, that depends. I think despite having these powerful social media profiles behind them, despite having the entire media ecosystem amplifying their message, Reform UK are only polling at about 30%. And that tells me that what they're selling isn't actually that popular. And it also tells me that any political party which offers hope and which provides a policy platform which could materially change people's lives for the better could clean up. So as Gary Stevenson talks about a lot, we're looking in the coming years at either populism from the right, which seeks to demonise, immigrants, poor people, or we're looking at populism from the left with some sort of hope for the future. The Overton window has shifted very much to the right, but we still have some hope. But it's up to us to actually make it happen and to prevent this rightward shift from going ever further. But anyway, thanks a lot for watching, guys. Please let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. But yeah, thanks a lot. See you next time.